Now we can begin the deliberations, if I may call it that, and we are delighted to introduce to you the first panel session of the day, which will be focused on navigating global political division, trade, climate, and industrial policy. And the chair for this very panel is Elena Almeida. Is she around here? Okay. If Elena Almeida could make her way to the stage while I take a very brief bio.
We're all back here with them. Yeah, I am Ella.
Yes. Okay. And I would just briefly introduce her while she would have the honor of introducing the rest of the panelists. She is a senior policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute, specializing in nature-related financial risk and central banking. She led the NGFS Inspire Study Group, which she may tell us more about, and co-authored the Central Banking and Supervision in the Belfair Reports. Elena also leads the CTEX work on nature-related financial risk and sustainable policy. Sounds like a lot which I'm eager to hear about, because I'm just media. But she will be chairing this panel, which speaks to navigating global political divisions, trade, climate, and industrial policy. Please, once again, join me to welcome, with your rounds of applause, Elena Almeida.
Great. Thank you so much, and it's so lovely to see so many of you here on a Saturday morning. It's a lot of dedication, and thank you to the speakers before. I learned a lot from the half an hour that I was in the audience listening in this morning. Welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science for our opening panel for the LSE Africa Summit. As mentioned, this year's theme, Securing Africa's Future, Promoting Resilience in a Divided World, seeks to critically examine Africa's evolving economic and geopolitical positioning in a globally divided world with a lot of uncertainty. As mentioned by our MC, I'm Elena Almeida, and I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute, and I am joined by an esteemed panel to discuss the topic of navigating global political division, trade, climate, and industrial policy. Our panel seeks to delve into the intersection of evolving geopolitical alliances, trade dynamics, and the green energy transition. We aim to explore how African nations can foster domestic industrial growth while simultaneously strengthening intra-African trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area. With climate change and environmental degradation posing significant threats, it is vital for Africa to advance its economic and social development with decarbonization and energy transition at its core. This discussion will highlight innovative ways that Africa can leverage its resources and solutions to navigate these global shifts. As this topic is quite intersectional and nuanced, I'm really pleased to have these esteemed panelists to discuss this topic and help us navigate these global political divisions. We are joined by Ronak Gopaldas, a political economist, writer, and speaker specializing in the intersection of politics, economics, and business in Africa. He is the director at Signal Risk, a fellow at GIBS, and co-founder of Mindflux Training. Formerly head of country risk at Rand Merchant Bank, Ronak is a prominent media voice and has appeared on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNBC Africa. He holds a Bachelor's in Comms in PPE, an MSc in Finance from SOAS, and several prestigious fellowships, including a visiting senior fellowship at LSE's Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa. We are also joined by Agnes Gitau, the Executive Director of the Eastern Africa Association, where she navigates East Africa's trade and regulatory landscape. She is also a partner at GBS Africa and a committee member at the East Africa International Arbitration Conference. Agnes is a trustee at Five Talents UK and contributes to research on sustainable trade, women in trade, and trade finance for organizations like the WTO and UN Economic Commission for Africa. And last but not least, we are joined by Kawale Shirwak, an economic development expert specializing in regional integration, trade, and infrastructure in the Horn of Africa. With over 10 years of experience, he has served as Somaliland's Minister of Planning, Chair of the Somaliland Development Fund, and a government advisor on trade and infrastructure. He holds an MSc in Development Finance from the University of Surrey and has been involved in major projects with the World Bank, the UN, and IOM-UN, including the successful DP World Berbera Port Agreement. Welcome to the panelists. Just as an aside, for the social media users in the audience, the hashtag for today's panel is hashtag LSE Africa Summit. The event is being recorded and will be made available through media channels. To start off the panel, I will ask the panelists to lay out some of their initial remarks with regards to this morning's topic. So I will give the time now to Rona. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and great to be here this morning. So I work in the field of risk analysis, and every hour in the Trump world is an event. So it's been a busy start to the year. But as I always say, in Africa, our risks are our rewards and our challenges are our opportunities. So I want to highlight what I call the 4 T's, which I think give us an indication of what we're dealing with in the current landscape and how we should be thinking about it. So the first one is obviously Trump. How do we think about Trump? It's an issue that affects everyone. I think the reality is that the global order is changing quite dramatically. The liberal global order as we know it is kind of dead. And the US has transformed from the underwriter to the undertaker of the liberal order. And that means geopolitical alliances are shifting. It means that things are changing quite rapidly. And it means that, the world of geopolitics now is being kind of played on military might, money, muscle, medium of communication, and message, which is soft power, right? So I think these kind of shifts have implications for Africa as well, whether it be through financial markets. Do we see a strengthening of the US dollar, which, as we know, has negative implications for African sovereigns? What does this mean for inflation? Again, we've seen what that does to financing costs across the continent. Trade, what's the future of AGOA? What does that look like? We've already seen cuts to foreign aid, change in climate policy. All of these have significant implications for the continent. And when we think about things like multilateralism, which emerging market and global south countries benefit disproportionately from, the strength of these institutions, I think that's under threat as well. So Trump is the first T. The second one is trade, and I think the geometry of international trade is changing. We've seen over the past few years the securitization of trade and industrial policy. This started during Trump's first term with the trade war with China. We also saw, then we had the COVID shock, which saw de-risking and decoupling. Then we had the disruptions in the Black Sea as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And now it's very much a case of kind of energy for security, and economic interests are linked to security and geopolitical considerations. So I think the trade dynamics are going to be interesting, and we're going to see how, which African countries emerge as winners and which ones as losers. Then the third question is the one of technology. We are moving into the fifth industrial revolution, which is underpinned by AI, automation, and clean energy. We know that we've got a lot of the critical minerals and rare earth minerals required for this transition across the African continent. But we've also been exploited as a continent in the past, and there is a risk of that happening again unless we exercise agency. So where are we going to feature in this kind of new technological era when global powers are vying for supremacy and need our minerals to kind of transition in that regard? And then the last question, or the last T, is one of talent. In a context where we've got a young population in Africa, fertility rates are far higher than they are in the rest of the world. This can be a massive comparative advantage. At the same time, when countries in the West, so-called weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, are not having babies, right? So is this an advantage? Do we export labor in the same way that Kenya is trying to do it? Do we risk brain drain, as is happening in places like Nigeria? What is the pathway here? How can we derive benefit from our young talent? So those are my 4Ts, and I will leave it there.
Thank you. That was incredibly interesting, the way that you put how all of these different elements merge into one big issue. I like the way that you framed the talent element, because we have a lot of young talent in the room, and framing it as a global resource or as brain drain. So one to think about as well. Now I'll turn to Agnes for her initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. I start by thanking the students who put this together, and also thanking our High Commissioners for making time on Saturday morning to come and speak to us. It shows the commitment, particularly what we're seeing in the African continent, the commitment of our African leadership, shifting away from political diplomacy to economic diplomacy, realizing the importance of really showcasing our continent at a time where everybody is probably trying to make sense of the ongoing political divisions. And carrying on from where Ronak left, so the 50 for me will be tariffs. And we had agreed, or I had decided that this morning we're not going to speak about the big T, Trumps, because everywhere you turn, everybody talks about Trumps and what that means for our continent. So we've seen global shifting, we've seen shifting dynamics in politics, economic policies. One question for me when we were invited to speak today was around the preparedness of the African continent. And in his opening speech, the High Commissioner for Senegal highlighted the importance of political unity, but also a unity that is intentional, that pushes Africa's development to ensure that we create opportunities for our young people, we create economies that create jobs for our continent. So what do we need to do? What we've seen when everybody is moving towards aligning themselves, we lack a unity in the continent, right? We've seen the European coming together to protect when one of their own is at risk. We've seen the Americans working together with their allied partners. But the African continent, we see a reaction, or lack of it, really. We lack consistent policies that address the challenges we face today. We had an opportunity during the COVID crisis where we had rhetorics from African leadership saying, this is Africans' opportunity, this is the one opportunity, a crisis that we cannot afford to lose. But after COVID crisis finished, we went back to status quo, whereby politicians went back to operating as if nothing happened. Now, beginning of the year, we've been told how the African economies are poised to grow, the fastest growing economies in the world. Again, that's just GDP. And we were told the fact that the South Africa is the chair of the G20. This is an opportunity for African voice at a global stage. But how can we have a voice when we have so many challenges? And we're going to talk about the challenges of infrastructure deficit, the challenges of financial constraint, where private sectors cannot access opportunities to build or access opportunities to access finance to grow their businesses. But where do we start? Where can we source this very rare finance? What do we need to do at home? We need to create incentives for businesses. We need to try and reassure private capital that Africa economies are competitive, that African economies are ready, and that once investors come to a continent, we will be able to protect their investment. We also need to reassure or build domestic private sector. Most of the time, what I see is our politicians rushing to give incentive to international investors. I think what is required now is building domestic private sector, supporting them with incentives, ensuring that our policies, particularly tax policies, are predictable so that businesses are able to plan and create opportunities for our young people. One of the keynote highlighted the importance of education. And constantly, it's a conversation, if you go to African forums, a conversation about the lack of education structures in the continent. How can we encourage, given the different priorities that our political leadership have, how can we encourage private investment in the education sector? And I believe once that is done, we are going to be able to create opportunities for our people. We'll speak more. I look forward to discussing around the ACFTA, around the Africa trade policy, and how we can have a decisive and consistent policy to ensure that when the world is shifting towards nationalistic policies, that our continent remains united, our continent moves away from just the rhetoric. If you go to African platform, our political leaders are very quick to say, this is where we want the continent to go, this is what we need to do, but we lack the action, we lack the political will to ensure that these incredible rhetorics, incredible policies that are on paper, particularly the Africa Union Agenda 2063, how can we actually implement them? What is required for us to fast track these policies to ensure that they're actually meaningful for the development of the African continent? I look forward to our panel discussions and also engagement with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnes. I hear you loud and clear with regards to the need for standing united in order to face these global challenges, and also to set out a vision in which you are not deferential to what international investors prefer, and see a better outcome and best outcomes for the continent. Now I turn to Kawale. Can you provide us with your initial remarks, please?
Thank you very much. I think we were given order to sit or stand up, so I'm told my talk comes out when I'm standing up. So I will talk. I won't take longer than. Good morning, Excellency, professors, students, and members of governments who are attending here. It's a privilege to have you, and it's a privilege that I'm given the opportunity to participate in the summit today. I will start with very small examples for a few minutes. I'm a son from Africa, but I grew up in Europe. I've seen what integration is, integrated markets, what single markets. I benefited what is called Erasmus education, where you can study different countries. I've seen Europe getting rich in my eyes. I've seen trucks moving, having borders countries, and suddenly trucks not having a borders. And I've seen the impact it had UK, Europe, and America. And that is the dream I think everybody should have in Africa, and that's what we can do, and that's what politicians should do. So I also want to add a few examples. If you just imagine a business in Nigeria want to trade in business in Kenya, and had to follow WTO and not necessarily follow trade. Imagine a small country. I arrive in Africa, and not far from where I live, and I have to wait for 1 hour to go through the transit. Imagine what business, how the impact will have in business. So Kenya exported 6 billion exports, 1 billion in US, other billions in other countries. The amount of trade it had with Ethiopia is minuscule. It's very little compared to that. And then we have to ask why. It's all to do with lack of political will and lack of trade integration. So therefore, there is a need. It is no longer an option. It is necessary, and we don't have to invent. Africa don't have to invent the wheel again. Europe have done it. America have done it. Global Asia have done it. I mean, there is no excuse we cannot do it. I mean, there is a lot of talk. The conferences like this and the previous ones, we all talk about historical legacies. We talk about what has held us back. And I appreciate that, and there's no denial about that. I attended a lecture, Professor James Robinson, a few days ago. And one statement he made really struck me, and which was it, but just do what Africa, nobody's using you to do it first. The other things remain, and that debate is open. Restoration and damage and loss, everything. But do what Botswana has done. Do other countries what they have done. Do other examples, and that's a good example. So I want to start. The current geopolitical, I think as I speak to you, I see Africa has an opportunity today for the first time in 40 years. The current geopolitical shifts give rise a multipolar world where competing partners, and also the ratification of African free trade agreement, put Africa in a unique situation where it can unlock its economic potential. and also address the issues of poverty and underdevelopment in the continent, which really belong in our continent. But to do that, it has to first acknowledge and accept and do something about it. The issues, the persistent obstacles that really hinder the continent for the last 70 years and long. And that include fragmented regulations, non-tariff barriers, which all contribute the cost and the complexity of trade between our nations and moving goods from one to another. And also we have to address the inadequate infrastructure, because we can't develop, we can't have an economy without no infrastructure. The poor roads, the congested ports, the unreliable energy grids, the limited digital connectivity across borders. These things we need to address, Africa needs to address, and it is possible that we have to address. Therefore, it is important that African policymakers and governments really collaborate with the African Union. And they have to do it, they have to harmonize regulations, they have to simplify customs procedures, they have to digitalize cross-border operations. And that is something necessary. It is not an option, that's something we need to do it. In terms of the industrial capacity, Africa lags behind, and that is not to its fault to some extent, but also it was the connections, trade connections, the legacy of colonial, that the industrial capacity is very low. Therefore, Africa, that forced us that we have to rely on importing unprocessed commodities to overseas, and also getting finished goods, which really is perpetuating, that's holding our country back. That's why we didn't make progress, because there is no technology innovation, there's no industries. So we have to address that, because it's no longer sustainable. Climate change and also this environmental degradation is also imposing our food security and development really a risk. So it has to be incorporated in our thinking and African policy thinking. What African policymakers should do is continental free trade agreements is an opportunity. It gives us deeper opportunity that we have to integrate. But the name itself, and really presentations I see everywhere, every country, it will not really deliver. What it will deliver is really commitment that comes from politicians from different countries, that they have to align the policy frameworks in their countries with the continental free agreement. I mean, I appreciate, and it is really something we can be proud of, that it has taken 5 years, that it has now in the ratification of 52 countries, and where other WTO, if you see it, it takes sometimes decades to really negotiate. So there is a will, and also the people in Africans are really looking to it. So finally I want to conclude it. I think I didn't go for my 5 minutes. I will conclude it. The infrastructure is also very important. African Development Bank and regional bodies are really doing, and there is a trade corridors, which I am very passionate about it, and that's going on. But African Development Bank is indicating there is a shortfall. They need in excess of 100 billion in order to really meet the basic infrastructure development that's needed in order to make after a continental free trade agreement to deliver it. Therefore, there is a will, and I think that's continuing. It's not only roads and highways what we need to build. It's a regional innovation systems. We have to build infrastructure, we have to build technology, we have to build energy, we have to build industrial zones, we have to build university and institutions. And that is the type of intervention that's expected of the policymakers, African policymakers. Technology and innovation is no longer an option. It's no longer something that one country should do and one country not do. Africa has fallen back behind. And this is a new revolution. And in 2030, we will have 42% of the youth in the global. The youth will not immigrate to Europe anymore, will not immigrate to America anymore. They have to live there in their continent and in their country. We need to create opportunities, and the only way we can create opportunities is to develop the industrial policies and also invest innovation and technology. Finally, I want to conclude this. I think very often in different parts of the world, we have said, and politicians and people who care about Africa said, Africa has a potential, Africa has a potential. I think politicians and people like you and me and the people who are in charge, we need to translate that country in potential to a continent that's delivering these promises. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kawale, for the passion that you have displayed here. And that was a really good opening session to set the scene. We talked about some of the challenges with regards to infrastructure development, with regards to potentially brain drain, and a lack of unification in terms of moving forward. But we also discussed plenty of opportunities with regards to the talent, with regards to learning lessons from regions that have already been successful, and what it means to have a growing vision for better outcomes for the continent. So we will start the panel discussion on the African Continental Free Trade Area next. And for the benefit of the audience, the African Continental Free Trade Area aims to boost intra-African trade by creating a single market for goods and services and aligning with the Pan-African vision of a prosperous and peaceful Africa under the African Union's Agenda for 2063. So the first question that I will ask all panelists, while many people support this free trade area, critics cite challenges like poor infrastructure, instability, and reliance on external trade. What do you see as the key advantages and challenges of increasing trade diplomacy in Africa? I will ask Agnes to go first on this question.
Thank you. It was interesting to listen to Kawale and the passion around Africa's potential. You know, if I got $1 every time I was told about my potential as an African, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I'd probably be somewhere on a sunny beach enjoying my life. But you're absolutely right. ACFTA is Africans' ambition to change the course of, or the path, to chart the chart for our continent. And I promise Professor David Luke that I'll say all the good things, given the contribution he's had towards this vision. And certainly, as we see market fragmentation everywhere else across the world, so we are promised that the promise of the ACFTA is huge market. So for businesses, particularly where the businesses that I represent, it's a market of consumer market of about 1.4 billion consumers. This for any business, depending on what you're producing, this is a huge opportunity. But how can you access this market? So it encourages opportunities to build our regional supply chain. I think one of the challenges, one of the constant narrative we hear is the lack of value addition for African goods, and the fact that most of our products end up in developed economies at primary level rather than manufactured, and therefore it doesn't create value for our products. So this Continental Free Trade Agreement, if it fully implemented, will create opportunities to build supply chains, value addition. It gives us as a continent a bargaining power. They say we are united in strength, right? As we see everybody pulling apart, is an opportunity for African continent to speak in one voice, to negotiate any trade agreement as a continent. And I refer back to the presentation by His Excellency Bello Kariki of Tanzania, whereby if developed economies like this one, they are very keen to supporting African vision towards regional integration. Instead of negotiating bilateral agreement with the individual country, they should approach any agreement with the continent at a continental level, but also a challenge to nations across African continent. If we really have bought into this vision, we need to negotiate any agreement as a collective, rather than Kenya signing economic partnership with the UK or economic partnership with the European Union at the expense of the regional agreement. It creates jobs. You know, not just African continent, there are challenges of high rates of unemployment, particularly for our young people. We are told that this will lift if ACFTA is fully implemented, the promise is that it will create opportunities and also lift 30 million Africans out of poverty. But there are challenges, and Kawale, you highlighted them. So the infrastructure deficit. This, for me, as much as it's a challenge, I think it's an opportunity for private sector to participate, work closely with government to support Africa's vision towards building our infrastructure. And what we need to do, and I highlighted in my remarks, the importance of incentives. How can African government come up with incentive, come up with PPP projects in the infrastructure sector, and ensure that these projects and these agreements that investors can take to the bank, make sure they're predictable and that they hold their part. Regulatory hurdles. We've seen the other T was tariffs. So making sure that non-tariff barriers are reduced, working together to ensure that national policies, again, as Carla highlighted, national trade policy are also aligned with the regional trade policy. Of course, our over-reliance on important goods. How can we ensure that we are creating value for products? How can we ensure that we become one of the challenges is the fact that we all produce almost the same goods, right? Kenya produces coffee, Ethiopia produces coffee, Tanzania and Rwanda the same. How can we ensure that we have diversified products so that we can be able to find what we're good at and find good markets for our product? So there are challenges, yes, but these trade policies and early stats shows that it is working, particularly within the Eastern African region. Also, I think the best way for me to implement ACFTA at a regional level is to try and implement the existing regional economic agreement. I'm aware that the tripartite agreement, particularly with the COMESA, LSE and SADC, has been quite successful, and we've seen development of trade, intra-regional trade growing. So based on this, and that inter-regional trade, as Professor would say, is based on value-added products. So, and therefore creating more opportunities and providing opportunities for our business. So there are opportunities within the SCFTA, but we need to be decisive. But we need to also try and fast track. So for the countries that have ratified the SCFTA agreement, how can we support each other to fast track this agreement to ensure that it is implemented and of course find ways of supporting each other so that we can pull together as a continent to ensure that SCFTA works.
Thank you so much, Agnes. Kawale, what about you? What do you think?
I think my colleague really covered most of it, but I think before I respond, when I stand up, I forget to thank Piro's Lila Institute African, and I attended the lecture David Luke. Fantastic, what Africa, the title is, what that book that David Luke written about Africa. And I hope you will read that, and that really sets the example what needs to be done. And thank you very much, everybody. I think if I contribute this debate, sometimes when you are academic and you become a politician and then you participate in this, you mix all of them and then you become more the politician, the talk will attract you. That's why I was more passionate. What I want to add to this debate is we, instead of discussing the advantage and disadvantage, I think that the need to integrate and open markets and really embrace a continental free trade agreement, it becomes necessary. The reason is we talking about population increase, 1.3 billion young population. Food insecurity in Africa is becoming an issue. How can you address? You can't only rely getting food outside. You can't rely aid, no more, it's finished. So what do we need to do? The countries need to develop, the country needs to become industrialized, country needs to trade, and that is the reality that we have to accept. It is no longer an option, it is necessary. And if we don't do it, nobody can predict what the future will be. Therefore, in the way I see it, it's important, and there are challenges. I mean, the challenges are not coming from Africa. It's coming from overseas as well. I mean, UK is really quickly making trade agreements with Kenya, individual countries. Other countries will go to Africa and make, when they see there are some trade deals, they will create their own deals. And that will create problem for African politicians and also the issue of inward-looking countries. You know, that small mindset that people, everybody looks their own interests. And that it will also create, that's what gets at us here, if you want to know an example. So therefore, how can it deliver what we're talking about, the continental free trade agreement and liberalization of the economy? Yes, there are risks. There is no what you call guaranteed success. Some countries will suffer. Maybe small countries will suffer. big countries like South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, these countries that are somehow a little bit prepared now will take advantage. But that is no reason to hold back and say we won't do it, because the small countries that are not developed will die if they don't do it. So therefore, what needs to be done, I think what I was reading the ACTA has already has put in place an industrialization strategy, a policy, which really outlines the key ingredients of economic growth, which is Africa, the development backbone is agriculture. So therefore, they have industries policy strategy which promotes agro and agro business, and also minerals, value-added minerals. So therefore, that means that these two sectors, if they start with, they already ratified and start, that means we producing food, we creating value added for the minerals, so that countries can join regional, it's good if African countries can join global value chain, that is ambition, but you need to start also regional value chains. Therefore, starting these minerals, what we are rich in, we talk about we are rich, unless we make the richness into potential, into reality, that the richness will be elusive. Therefore, to create regional value chain, for example, some countries are very protective. We know that. Nigeria was in the beginning very protective in their infant industry, automobile, in rice production. The other countries, like East African countries, was very protective in textile industries, and it is logic in South Africa. But what we are seeing now, countries are realizing it is not only risk, there are potential. We see financial services. People are already moving. We see Nigerian companies taking, banks in Nigeria taking assets in South Africa, significant amount of assets. We see Ethiopia, which is really most closed economy, is opening its financial services, and foreign companies are coming in line with Continental Free Trade Agreement. Small countries, so what I see it here, there are provisions or mitigations the countries can use in terms of weaknesses that countries can use. Those are worried about their small industries. There are there are mitigations. I think I can't say figures, but I mean there are measures that they can protect their sectors if they are not ready yet. There are African countries or Continental Free Trade Agreement can help these, but they must also become realistic and say which sectors can we compete in a global.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ronak, what are your perspectives?
So I'm going to keep it quite simple, right? So Africa is trying to go in a direction where the rest of the world is going in the opposite direction. More walls are going up, there are more tariffs, there's more protectionism, and we're saying we need to integrate, we need to break these things down. Intra-Africa trade is 18%, something like that. So the reality, and I think this is the lesson that we should have learned through COVID, is that nobody's coming to rescue us. We have to take control of our own future, and we have to come up with African solutions to African problems. Now, if you look at all the key themes that emerged in the wake of the pandemic, digitization, localization and regionalization, industrialization, they all underpin what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is trying to achieve. So Africa needs to bet on itself. There's no two ways about that. We can play the economic diplomacy game, and we should, and that's going to be very important, but the reality is that, to Agnes's point, it's safety in numbers, you get scale, size, gravitas, bargaining power, negotiation skills, all of that if you integrate. So I think that's the first thing, right? The other thing is that there's a template here. The European Union has been forged in crisis and has kind of gone to the brink and often come back because they recognize that if you don't integrate, you're just a random collection of small companies, or small countries rather. I think the UK has learned that lesson after Brexit turned into Regrexit. But I think the reality is that we have to integrate. Then the second point is that you need institutions, and strong institutions, and this is where the AU and the Commission chair the Secretariat needs to kind of take the lead and sell this vision to not only the man on the street, but also to the private sector and businesses, to get them to recognize that this is in their interests. And then you've got this tension between Pan-Africanism and national interests with short election cycles. So how do you reconcile that? And then to the point around big versus small economies on the country. What is the harmonization mechanism, and how do you create that safety net? So then, it comes down to political will, the strength of institutions, the fact that you can use crisis as opportunity, and incremental gains are also important. But the reality is that we have to build the wings of this airplane while it's flying. There's no other way, given our demographics. This is the anchor and the grand vision around which we need to build around. And I think the role of the private sector is not spoken about enough in this regard. And what's the low-hanging fruit here? It's the regional economic communities. So that's kind of where I would land on this.
Great, thank you. My conclusion from that part of the panel is that as the world pulls apart, it's important for Africa to bind together and to think about whether continental inequalities need or should not mirror actually global inequalities when it comes to trade policy and how integration is incredibly important. So moving on to the second part of the questions, I wanted to talk about climate change and environmental degradations and their implications for global political divisions. My question to the panelists is, how can sustainable development practices be effectively implemented into industrial and trade policies in Africa? This time I will start with Kawale.
Well, as you rightly mentioned, climate change and environmental degradation is an issue, it's a reality, and though maybe Africa hasn't contributed most to this, what is causing this environmental damage, we bearing the burden, we bearing the problem of. Therefore, the debate is where the priority should be, and that is very not easy discussion when it comes to the Africa and what Africa needs to do, the priorities. Africa had, in terms of finances and what they need to do, very limited. We're talking about that they have deficit in terms of infrastructure financing, and to invest in green energy and climate-friendly projects, it's adding costs. But it is important because the impact is also on the food security for Africa and for the people. So therefore, there is a need for global collaboration. That is really essential. And there will be no responsibility for specific countries, but we have to take the responsibility, all of us, and there is I think, great deal, the Western countries and rich countries must work in collaboration with Africa to address this. And I understand, but I mean, if you talk to politicians, sometimes they have some valid points, which is really the priority. We're talking about food insecurity, but we have also opportunity because Africa has minerals, which are really, those are maybe will mitigate the climate, the production of materials. Therefore, I will conclude. It's essential. Countries must invest, and because we are now investing in industries and infrastructure, we can make these projects climate friendly, but also continuation status quo as we are now. The transport, the way we are food production is all contributing to the crisis that we are facing. Therefore, there must be a change. But who will contribute that? That is the debate we need to have.
Great. Rana, what do you think? Is the green transition an opportunity? What do you see as the sustainable economic development challenges for Africa?
So the African continent has this very unique trilemma where it's got to balance energy access with mitigation and adaptation with the impacts, right? And those of you in my classes here at LSE will have known that I described this as a wicked problem, which is both a kind of a challenge and a risk, but also an opportunity. And so within this context, I think there are a few big themes playing out, right? So one is, as I've spoken about earlier, the securitization of trade and industrial policy. It's a kind of energy for security, and global powers are looking at the energy, defense, technological needs and trying to align in that regard. Then there's this question of resource nationalism, which is playing out, and we're seeing this across the continent. There's a new wave of a resource boon where Africa can power this new wave of industrialization, But countries are taking different approaches. And justifiably, countries across the continent want a bigger slice of the pie. Now, the approaches are very different. Botswana has just done another deal with De Beers, which is kind of seen as a win-win deal for both the government and the corporation. But at the same time, countries in West Africa are kicking out and arresting mining executives, very draconian laws around royalties and taxes and things like that, a bit of a shakedown. And so this, I think, is going to become a big theme. And then there's the question around what is fair and what's not, right? So where, in the beneficiation value chain should African countries play? Because not every African country can do the same thing. So this is, again, to the point around integration and understanding, where in the value chain you play. How do you use your port? If you're a landlocked country, what do you do? Where is your banking system stronger? How do we integrate in these regional communities to make sure that we derive maximum benefit from what's happening and how the spoils of this kind of new wave are shared? So I think ultimately then it comes down to this question of framing, question of fairness, and the biggest issue is the question of financing, right? And Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, is on record as saying if the dollar strengthens, if the US raises interest rates, if China closes the taps, if there's an energy crisis in Europe and suddenly you're going from paying 7% on your international Eurobond to almost 20% and you're locked out of international capital markets, instead of spending on productive things and development priorities, you're just servicing debt. And this is why there's been such a push from the Global South, the G20, towards reforming the global financial and political and economic architecture, because countries on the continent feel like they're fighting this battle with one hand tied behind their back. So it's essentially, I think that the financing issue is critical, and that really does need to be addressed.
Great, thank you. That's a really good point. Agnes, what are your thoughts?
It's often difficult to come back after Veronica has spoken, but I'm just going to give 3 short answers. I think we should continue. We should still aim to industrialize. We need to grow our economies, right? Encourage investment in renewable energy by offering incentives like tax breaks, but not just for international investment, but also for domestic private capital to ensure that they invest in some of the infrastructure development that we're looking for. Regulation that enforces low carbon production, encourage sustainable sourcing, and also enforce ESG compliance. There's a lot of conversation about ESG values, but rarely do we find or we don't have policies that enforces this or measures the compliance, right? Again, and we've talked about it, aligning ACFTA goals with national green goals, right? Investment in clean tech, I think that it's a conversation that constantly you hear the importance of carbon markets, climate finance, and how we can access that. But we cannot move away from our climate policies because Trump has all of a sudden decided it's okay to develop oil and gas capabilities. African climate crisis is a reality, and we keep talking about it, and we cannot wait for global policies to guide us on what we do. So we need to decide what is required to address the climate crisis that we face. What are the African solutions? I know it's a cliche when we talk about Africa's solution for climate crisis, rather than dictated by the rich countries. And also, we still need to develop our economies. We still need to move ahead with Agenda 2063, irrespective of what anybody else is doing. I think, and I keep insisting that we can't always wait for people to decide, then react to our policies. I don't see anywhere where there is clarity on Africa's climate policy. There are national policies. I know some countries are better than others, but we must find collective or regional policy and then use that to try and drive our national policies. But look, we say that Africa has contributed very little to the climate crisis, but I keep insisting, particularly from the space I work in, working with the international and regional private sector, it's not our time to pollute. It's our time to ensure we do good business. It's our time to ensure that our businesses protect our environment, because if you want to grow wealth, if you want to build companies that live beyond you, those companies must be able to do good business in the continent. Thank you.
That's really insightful. I am conscious of time, and I want to give the audience an opportunity to think about their questions that you would like to ask the panelists. While you think about it, I'll take 2 or 3 questions, but I wanted to kind of just wrap up that discussion in saying that I really like the point that you raised, Ronak, on needing to reform the international monetary system, the capital market system, in order to ensure that Africa as a continent and all countries in the global south have equity and fairness when it comes to accessing capital, especially those countries that are facing the physical risks of climate change. Okay, I see a few hands, so I'll take 1 question there, 1 here, and 1 back there. Do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Sure, yeah. Hello, my name is Idia Urele. I am Nigerian American, but I live and work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think that, thank you all so much for your comments. It's given us a lot to think about. Obviously, from the context of the DRC, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the challenges that some of our regional conflicts pose when it comes to integrating our markets. I think that we probably all agree when it comes to the benefits that we can reap from having markets integrated, from integrating our labor forces, et cetera. But in the case of the DRC specifically, one of the key components of the conflict in the eastern DRC is the fact that the neighboring countries are not able to agree on who can benefit from the critical minerals and how they can work together so that everyone can benefit. And there's a lot of exploitation and a lot of violence. And so my question to you is, how can we get over the hurdles that we already have, specifically when it comes to critical minerals and when it comes to the lack of capability to process middle stage on the continent some of these resources that we have.
Great, and we had a question. There was someone in the middle. Oh, do you want to go for it first?
Thank you all for your really great insight. My name is Justice. I come from California, and my question, I know you mostly, all of you mentioned the 4 T's, tariffs, Trump, of course, transportation, trade, and tech. But one of the interesting things that I've been researching and studying is the barriers in which that unify African countries, which is transportation. I know one of you touched on Pan-Africanism and politicians. And I think one of the major barriers that I'm witnessing and we're seeing is that these countries and not really opening their borders and I would say being comfortable enough to unifying with each other. So my question is, how does transportation play into the industrial policy and unifying Africa and empowering different youth to do the same?
Great, and there was a
Thank
question
you.
back there.
My name is Elvis Oga. I am the Executive Director for Africa Center for Geoeconomics and Development. We are discussing trade, climate, and industrial policy. So I'm going to ask a question under each of them and direct each to one of the panelists.
If you could make it brief, we only have 5 minutes left, so we want to give the panelists also a chance to respond to all of the questions.
All right. So, under trade, I would like to ask, how can Africa, as a continent, move from being just supplier of raw materials to becoming an active participant in the global supply chain?
Okay, maybe I stop you there and ask the panelists to reflect on these 3 questions, and then we'll try to open up for another round if we have time. Does anyone want to take the questions on DRC and critical minerals?
I guess since I'm from East Africa, it's only right if I take the DRC question. So the escalating crisis in Eastern DRC is worrying. We've had intervention both from the regional economic, the REC, so EAC, SADC, as well as, and now the Qataris, right? So one thing that we haven't discussed in this panel is the political stability and security of people and investment. And also the bad behavior of African political leadership. And that's something we need to address. If we are really going to move the African continent from where we are to a continent that is dignified because our people live well, our people are respected, we need to address the issue of political behavior, right? In Eastern DRC, there are very many factors playing in. You have mining companies, you have African politicians, so I don't want to get into the dynamics of the political interference from the region, but it's an opportunity. A stable DRC is a stable. It means the region is stable. DRC joined the East African Community, I think, last year, and the vision around that is that if DRC is incorporated into the EAC, it means that businesses in East Africa can access DRC market, but also an opportunity for stability within DRC. That was the vision amongst the political leaders, which the private sector welcomed. However, because of these external factors and because of lack of political stability, it is therefore where you see interference. That's why if DRC was stable, if Tshisekedi was running an inclusive government, I'm sure you won't see this kind of games going around. I'm sure DRC is able to manage its own resources. DRC is able to decide who they partner with, and also DRC is able to build an environment where companies, not just international companies, can invest and trade in the country. So look, this is a conversation, and I think it will take really serious reflection amongst African political leaders. We keep blaming everybody else. We keep blaming our problems on everybody else but ourselves. But for DRC case, I think political stability is important. We also, even again around ACFTA, the regional RECs really must be empowered. The regional RECs must move away from political interference and continue with the vision where they were established for economic development, for regional integration, for trade integration and development. So there is an opportunity. DRC, I think, supplies over 70% of cobalt, copper, right? And all that is mostly traded through, other countries in the region. I see an opportunity in political stability to be able to drive all these things we've spoken about. And that's the one answer for me. Lack of political stability is what is driving this crisis.
Cool. So I'll try kind of link all three of them. So the first question on the DRC, I think ultimately Agnes is right. It comes down to a leadership question. But, in an era where it's about kind of hard power and money and resources, and it's purely transactional, there are risks of exploitation. And this is kind of what's always happened, divide and conquer strategies. And this is going to require kind of collective vision to avoid kind of selling, your country's crown jewels. Now, whether we have the leadership on the continent that is able to do that is another question entirely, right? We've got old leaders for a young continent. And I think, that generational gap and the quality of our leadership really does need to improve across the continent. To the point around transportation, it's not just land, it's ocean and digital connectivity. All of this is really important in catalyzing and unlocking trade. And if we can get these right, just given energy shifts in the world, the environment that I've spoken about, this, again, Africa is kind of central from a global production, consumption perspective, in terms of its resources and in terms of trade and energy corridors. So, of course, infrastructure investment, hard, soft, and digital, very important. And then the last question, ultimately, it's about identifying comparative advantages, where you play in the regional value chain. Not every country can do everything. So again, it requires strategic collaboration alongside with the external partners playing the economic diplomacy game. Unlike during the Cold War, where it was very ideological and African countries became basically, vassal states in a proxy war, effectively now you just want to be pragmatic and you want to do what's in your strategic and economic and geopolitical interests. So I think that's an important piece in a world where everyone's competing for what Africa has.
Thank you so much. Do you want to wrap it up with one sentence?
I think all has been said, but I will add this. Conflicts exist in different parts of the world, and we see global and countries and leaders who are trying to resolve it. We see crisis happening around here in Europe, near to Europe. So therefore, my answer to you will be the responsibility, first responsibility, lies to the East African community, the leaders in that region that really also involved. They must show example, and they must set an example. If they can do it, they also African leadership, because that is the problem that we are living with, credibility. If we have conflict in Sudan and Democratic Republic of Congo, and we cannot resolve it, the world will not listen it. The other question, I think that area you touch it is the area that Continental Free Trade Agreement predicted it will open unprecedented opportunity that nobody could fill. Logistics, transport, railways, if we implement and ratify. I think we're running out of time, and I think I will conclude that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists, for your amazing responses. I think this really set the stage for the rest of the conference, and I'm sorry I didn't get to all of your questions. You have the whole day. I hope you have a good conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, you can continue with that round of applause for Elena Almeida for that masterful handling of panel, the very first panel of the day, and she has done such a great job.